Jaimie, welcome to the How I Became podcast. I am so excited to have you on and have the opportunity to tell your story.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
I think it was really fascinating that you have parents who come from more of a traditional background. So, for example, your dad is a lawyer and yet you're an entrepreneur. So I'm curious how that influenced you and guided you still into this entrepreneurial world.
hmm I think it gave me balance. I think when you're a creative person or an artistic person, it can sometimes, or at least for me, it was hard to focus at a young age. Going into university and how am I going to turn my art into a career? I knew I didn't want to be a fine artist. I was more creative than I was technical. um, I really struggled with how to do that. In retrospect, it was a blessing because I think the foundation that I had from getting a BA, which my parents were very supportive of my love of art, but they said, you got to get a BA first and then you can do whatever you want. And it was a really great decision on their part to push me into that. It allowed me to get a foundation and then take my creativity and sort of run with it and turn it into a business. Um, from an entrepreneurship standpoint, I have very creative grandparents, a grandmother who was a fine artist, a very well known Canadian artist. And so, I saw entrepreneurship there. My father's father owned a menswear store. There was entrepreneurship there. And so I did have models of it. And I think that, that more solid, stable foundation maybe coming from parents who, like a father who was a lawyer, mixed with the non-tradition of having entrepreneur parents was like a really great mix for me as role models.
It's so fascinating. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your grandmother, a famous artist in Canada. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about her journey and what you learned from her as an artist, but also a woman who like took her career off in like a such an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, I've got really strong grandmothers on both sides of my family. So, and very different, and their upbringings were very different, and the way they ran their households were very different, but both very strong, independent women. So, my grandmother on my dad's side, her name is Anne Harris, and she's a very famous Canadian sculptor. She actually traveled the world showing in galleries and museums before women really left their husbands at home and went to do that. Like women stayed home and took care of their children, while the men worked. That was just society at the time. So my grandfather was really supportive of letting her do her thing. And my dad and his siblings tell these really funny stories about when they were growing up in Tillsonburg, Ontario. Their mom used to take a baby gate, like a playpen baby gate, into the backyard, but she wouldn't confine the children. She would confine herself with like an easel so no one bothered her while she was painting. And I always loved that story.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah,
It
it
shows
was
like just in that little story, it's like she thought differently. She was like, I'm not going to put the kids in the playpen. I'll put myself in it
totally.
and let them not bother. Like they probably bothered her even less because they had so much more room to explore.
Exactly. I mean, they were safe inside the confines of their backyard with a
Of
fence,
course.
but like
Yeah, yeah.
it really is very different than what you hear of women at the time. And she traveled the world. My dad was, I mean, she fell into art a little bit later. She was always very creative. Her father owned a scrap yard, so she was always collecting scraps and building sculptures. But as a career, she really fell into it in her 30s when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she started sculpting as a form of therapy. And that sort of led to her entrepreneur journey where she was sculpting, then she was showing, then she was, her pieces started to be in museums and she had galleries all over the world. And they're like growing up, the stories of, oh, you see that grand piano? It was a barter between your grandmother and a gallery owner in Europe, and then she had to have it shipped home. And it's like all these little crazy stories of amazing pieces of art on her walls growing up, which were also barters with other artists that were represented by those galleries and artists who were no one, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and who are very famous artists now. So really, really cool. Um, so that there was always that creativity, and it was always encouraged, and it was very familiar, I think, to my father because he grew up with it. And then there's my grandmother on the other side, and she, came to Canada in the early 1950s. After the Second World War, she came here with $5 in her pocket, and she built this beautiful life with her husband and, her children, who's my mom's family. And her entrepreneurship journey, and I'm very close with her. She's 99 years old. She's still alive.
Wow.
She's amazing. I'm very close with her. And I've always found her entrepreneurship journey very interesting because it is as a homemaker, but she had to sort of survive and make something out of nothing, coming to a country as an immigrant. And so the clothing she made, the way she kept her home, the way she was very creative and how she took care of her kids and provided for them as they were sort of growing their life here is also like another form of this entrepreneurship journey, which, I look up to her very much in that respect as well.
It's incredible to see the like powerhouse of female
Mm-hmm.
inspiration that you had around you. Curious, the grandmother that came from overseas, where did they come from? Like where were they
Came
coming
from
from in Europe?
France.
Oh
She was
wow.
born in Paris, and my grandfather was born in Poland, and they met after the Second World War. My mom was born in Paris, and
Wow.
they immigrated to Canada. They came over on a boat. And you say, why Toronto? This is like so interesting and like a sliding doors journey of
Yeah.
what direction could your life have gone in. I think the boat came through Nova Scotia. So a lot of people just hopped off in Nova Scotia, and that's
Yeah.
where their family's roots now lie. And so they decided to keep going to Toronto. And this is where they settled.
It's so fascinating. I always find those stories so inspirational because how scary to one get it's not like you can look up on Instagram and be like, where are the hot places to go in Toronto these days? You're really taking such a bet, and then taking a boat across the world is just mind-blowing. So it's so fascinating. And then you have to have perseverance because you're showing up in a new place with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's
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 wild.
really incredible. Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. It sounds like you have a very close family and very
Mm-hmm.
inspirational. So um sometimes it's hard to pick a moment or like something that happened that inspired you, but are there themes of this like artistry or these like passionate women that help drive you into starting This Is Jay? And maybe we can talk a little bit about what the company is.
I manufacture pajamas. We
Yes.
we started off as a headband company. So 21 years ago, I sewed a headband to keep my hair to my face while I was studying for university exams. And I was shopping a few days later, and one of the store owners was like, "I love your headband. Where did you get it?" I said, "I made it." She's like, "Do you sell them?" And I was like, "Why, yes, yes, I do." Like, it was
Of
just a
course.
moment. Talk about a sliding doors moment. Like, it was like, I do. And then all of a sudden, it was like 24 hours later, I had a headband business. It was like I made a business card, I made some headbands. And, as a university student, I'm like, great, this is going to be my summer job. I'm going to make some money. This
Yeah.
is going to be great. Um, and so that's how I started. It was very innocent. It was towards the end of university, not knowing what I wanted to do, but still following that path of I'm going to go to art school after I get my BA, which I did. And I moved home to Toronto. I went to OCAD to, see what that journey was going to look like. And after a year, I left because I sort of realized my creativity. I mean, I learned a lot in that year, but I also knew I did not want to be a fine artist. And I really, at the time, it was hard to, I mean, right, I believe now OCAD is very focused on business and art. Like you can sort of do both streams. But back then it was just art. And so I really
Right.
wanted to incorporate the business part. So after that one year, I just kept running with my business. We evolved from headbands to pajamas to printing our own fabric, milling our own fabric, everything done in Canada. And it's just been constant growth really from there. And in terms of just sort of the women in my life and I guess the effect that they've had on my trajectory, being from a close-knit family where everyone's championing you regardless of what you're doing. I have one sister who's an investment banker. I have another sister who's a chiropractor. We all do very different things, and we have the
Yeah.
same cheerleading section for us across the board with our family. But like having the support of the men and women in our family has allowed all of us to pursue our passions. And I think after getting that BA, that was enough to say, okay, you have a foundation. So where are you going to go from here? What are you going to do? So when I started my entrepreneurship journey, no one was like, you're like, you got to do something more traditional or don't waste your time, because I already had that foundation. So if I did waste a year or two, it wasn't the end of the world.
It was okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
It
that was
also
sort of
seemed
my
like
start.
I was gonna say, I think it seems like your family would also encourage taking that explore. Like they wouldn't. Let's say this is Jay started and it wasn't as successful as it turned out to be.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like your family, and coming from this like take risks and trial and error and explore, the world on as an artist mentality, would encourage you to test it, and it wouldn't be a failure. It'd be an experience in life, which as an entrepreneur to have that mindset, I think is such a key to success.
For sure. I think there was also a
Yeah.
fascination because I have like a lot more traditional people in my family, this fascination with no one ever knew what I was doing. Still to this day, I think that, we're always for photo shoots, we're building sets, we're coming up with concepts, we're doing the creative, and people sort of see a snippet of it. And then 5 months later, they see the finished campaign and they were like, I had no idea that was the direction you were going in. And, I think that there was a lot of excitement for family members and my husband, who was a new boyfriend of mine at the time. My little wins seemed like everyone's wins too, because everyone was sort of helping in their own way along that journey.
If I can be super nerdy, it's like taking that, like your grandmother was this famous sculptor of physical things, but you were kind of sculpting this new business and this new future for yourself and finding a way, although you knew you didn't want to be a fine artist, but it's almost like a really great balance of maybe more of like the traditional business route that of your dad, and then this artsy getting to do the campaigns and building a business, and it's just like a different way of tapping into your creative side.
Well, I used to talk to my grandmother, like because she was so tactile, I'm so tactile too. It sort of becomes more of a trial and error personality. So you go to school and you learn, and someone like my sister, who's an investment banker, she learns from reading books. Like
Right.
that's the way her brain focuses and learns. Even to this day, it's like if I'm really trying to work something out, I need like a pack of colored markers and a blank piece of paper to block out my ideas. It's like a very visual, weird, like sometimes my husband will say to me, like I'll be, visualizing something lying in bed at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm visualizing it on the ceiling, and he'll look over at me and say, can you visualize with your eyes closed? Because you're freaking me out. Like staring so intensely at the ceiling. Um,
But you can like see it. That's really funny.
And so, as I was starting my business, it was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of testing things out. And that's my process. That's what I need to do, as opposed to just working out numbers. Obviously, you have to work out numbers on paper. That's a big part of it too, hence the business side. But um, there's this tactile artistic side, which I've inherited, I feel, from my grandmother, which is, having to create something and figure out how it's going to work to be able to really know if it's going to be something that you can run with.
How did you go from, because a lot of what we've talked about so far has been on the creative, artsy side, but we're missing the business side, the numbers, as you mentioned it. So it wasn't in OCAD. I assume it wasn't in your BA. So where did you learn the business side of things?
That was just slow growth. I think as a small business owner, when you start, especially when you're making things, because when I first started, I made every piece by hand. So
Right.
there was different facets of it. It was, the concepts, then the creation, the execution, and then how am I going to sell this? And so when I first started at the One of a Kind show in Toronto, which is actually the one direct to consumer show we still do, the first time I ever went to that show, it was a huge learning experience to be in front of our customers, to see how they reacted. And that was an interesting side of the business. And then the other side was meeting with stores. Every meeting I took, and my whole thought process, and it continues to be the same, is I will try anything as long as it doesn't bankrupt me. Because, you want to, you always want to be open to opportunity.
Yeah.
So with the business side, when I first started, it was taking meetings with stores, and it was sitting down and really listening to what they had to say. And some stores would say, "Where's your line sheet?" And I'd say, "Here it is." And they're like, "Oh, it's missing this, this, and this." And then you'd go back and you'd research that and you'd add it the next time. This is pre being able to Google everything. So now you have a question about P&Ls, you can Google the question about P&Ls, and you can get like a pretty good broad understanding of what it is. There was a family friend who owned a bunch of women's boutiques who had a lot of insight to give on manufacturing, which is a whole other thing as well. I would say when I first started, the hardest thing was really the manufacturing, to make sure we could find partners that we liked and could trust. The business evolution part wasn't hard. It comes pretty naturally when you have to do your balance sheets and your margins, and you learn a lot along the way. And
Yeah, totally. I did my undergrad in neuropsychology, and similar. I was like, not for me. Like, very interesting, not something I'm going to pursue a career in. And I ended up getting into liquidation, so I'd buy and sell overstock, and that snowballed into licensed apparel and um understanding like that manufacturing process and what is importing fees and the taxes and when factories shut down. I mean, we were doing overseas, so a little bit different, but it's a huge learning curve, and it's a
Mhm.
whole other side of the business that you just a shirt should just arrive, and
But it
but no,
doesn't.
every but it doesn't. There's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
that goes into that, and the
a lot.
stitching and the tagging, and so I imagine as from going from headbands to pajamas and beyond, there's a lot of learning and tweaks and failures and wins that I'm sure you experienced along the way. Is there anything that stood out to you as a big learning throughout the process from the headbands to where you are today?
I don't know if there's one specific thing. I like to, I'm like all heart and all creativity. And so I love when I'm presented with facts and numbers, because I love to see if the way I'm feeling is accurate based on the
Huh.
statistics, or
Hmm.
if like I'm completely wrong. Either way, love it. Like whether I'm wrong
Yeah.
or I'm right. And I think that maybe is a good description of my business side. It's, I think creatively, but I absolutely love numbers. Like, give me all the data. Love it. So along my like the journey and the evolution, I think as we scaled, it was it wasn't one pivotal moment, but like all these little moments that sort of came together. And some were really bad. I would say like some of the lowest points were some of the biggest pushes to get us to where we are now. And I say that to people all the time.
Hmm.
It's like the wins are great, but it's how you handle the losses that really define you as an entrepreneur. Because if you're able to learn from them and propel yourself forward, they actually make you so much stronger.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're just kind of moving along on this trajectory of everything's working, everything's working, everything's working. That you might not be looking at everything else that's going on around you, or seeing what else you could be doing to grow or do things better. So I think it's really been that combination of, wins and losses to be able to get me to where I am now.
Do you have tips or tricks for future entrepreneurs or people who are currently building a business of in those lows or when you're in a point of maybe that wasn't the right call, how to get yourself out of it? Because it's as a solo entrepreneur that it's lonely, it's really hard. So I
For sure.
imagine you might have some ways to keep yourself motivated, and maybe it's different today than it was in the earlier days,
Different only because you can Google the answer to things. But I
right?
think, I think also part of my growth and the growth for small businesses, big businesses, there's really smart people out there. So you don't have
Yeah.
to be an expert in creativity, an expert in design, manufacturing, P&Ls. You don't have to be an expert in all these things. If you can surround yourself with smart people who are also able to help because they're experts in that one little area. So I think having people that I can go to, and even before I had my own team, it was, you know, trusting your inner circle, saying to my dad, like, I'm kind of struggling with this. Do you know anyone that sort of been in manufacturing, or saying to a friend of a friend who I know has a little bit of experience in manufacturing, can I run something by you? And sometimes people are like, no, I can't help you. I have no idea. And other times it's a conversation over coffee that just sparks a new idea in you and
Hmm.
helps you reframe your thinking to be like, okay, I'm not at a dead end. And I think
Right.
that is sort of the thing I have found the hardest. It's like when you feel like you're at a dead end with an idea or with a problem or a loss, and you're just like, I don't know which direction to go in. Um, my philosophy has always been, if you don't stay stagnant. Like if it means a conversation with someone or coffee with someone, even though it might not go anywhere, just keep asking questions to try and figure out a new path around the issue.
Yeah, it's really good advice, and I love like mentors, and networking to me is like the key. It's the most important thing, and I think by networking and building that mentors around you, or people who have your back around you, you kind of can tap into different people for those different problems.
Mm-hmm.
What about the flip side? So I asked a little bit about like getting through the hard times, but are there moments throughout this journey that stand out to you as like huge wins, really big, exciting moments that you reflect on, that you've celebrated over, the past, what has it been? 15
21,
years?
21.
21 years? Yeah.
1 years. Yeah. There's been like very exciting moments, and they're sort of in different areas. So there's been really exciting PR moments where you see a celebrity wearing your products. And this was like some of the really exciting ones were pre-Instagram, pre-social media, where like one day you'd open In Touch magazine and there'd be like a celebrity wearing my headband, and we'd be like, oh my gosh. And it was
So
all very
exciting. I
exciting.
hope you framed those.
We have a lot of them framed. Yes. Yeah. They were
Perfect.
very exciting, and it was a very different time. Um, and so there was those PR wins. Then we'd also have wins where like we'd be negotiating really big deals, and we'd negotiate a deal to make 500,000 headbands for a company. Or there would be a store like, I just recently read that I think Fred Siegel is going out of business. Are you familiar with Fred Siegel?
Hmm.
So when I was starting
Wow.
21 years ago, that was like a boutique mecca of somewhere you wanted to see your products. And
Yeah.
we were doing a trade show in New York, or maybe it was Las Vegas, and Fred Siegel placed an order. And it was just like so exciting to
Yeah.
have a store that you love and aspire to be part of, take an interest in what you're doing. So like those are some big wins, some little wins. But overall, I would say our absolute biggest win was being able to pivot in COVID and grow despite all the challenges.
I want to talk about COVID because I know you guys pivoted from about 25% e-commerce pre-COVID to 95% e-commerce throughout the pandemic. So, can you elaborate on that experience and how that's a huge, undertaking to completely convert your business to online.
Mm-hmm.
So some of that experience.
So, I think that something that made the pivot possible at the rate we did it, how quickly we did it, was that we were already set up for all these initiatives. Like we already had ads in market with Facebook and Instagram. We were already doing advertising on Google. We were just doing it on a
Right.
much smaller scale because it wasn't the main focus of my business at the time. So when COVID
Right.
happened and we made this pivot, it wasn't starting from scratch. Like a lot of businesses had to build websites from scratch. We were already selling online. We already had a 3PL, like an external warehouse that was packing and shipping our orders. So, the scaling, I feel very lucky that we had grown to that place. So when we decided to scale really quickly in the e-com market, we were able to because everything was already there. It was just investing more money.
Right.
And I say that we took a 5-year plan and we did it in 5 months because we were planning on, reallocating budget from, our traditional rep groups that were selling our products and wholesale shows that we were going to sell to stores, which was our main business. We
Right.
were planning on saying, okay, that's 75%, 25% is e-com. We need to sort of even this out, or we see area for growth in e-com. We need to carve out the time and attention it needs. Here's our 5-year plan to do it slowly. And so when we saw in those first few weeks of stay-at-home orders that, our stores were all closing down, everyone was canceling their orders, we saw pretty quickly that there was this shift, and we took all of our deposits back from all of the wholesale shows, because at that time they were offering refunds. In those first few
Right.
weeks, it was like, sure, take your money back. It's only going to be a few weeks. So
Right.
we decided to pull all of those investments and put it all into ecom. So it was a massive shift very quickly. And we had a good team of people who were, overseeing the back end of our website and our coding to make sure everything was working. And we had a team of people who were doing our ads, and we had a team of people who were putting our ads into market and following that. And so we all sort of came together and we're like, everyone was sort of running on adrenaline of like, oh my God, what is going on? Are we safe? And how can we keep our businesses running and our families safe? And we all just sort of made a quick plan and ran with it. And so there was really no turning back. It was just this trajectory for
Do you remember the feelings that you had during that? Like, were you crying every evening? I imagine I'd be like panicking. How did you feel?
It was, I mean, in retrospect, because I think it was probably 2 years of not being able to sit and actually decompress and think about what had just happened, because there was so many different facets.
Right.
It was business, but it was also, if you remember at the beginning, it was keeping your family safe, making sure they had
Yep.
toilet paper. Our kids weren't in school. I have 3 kids. So it was a very interesting mixture of emotions. I would say, being a mother at that time and an entrepreneur, it was this feeling of, is my team safe? Are my kids safe? Are my parents safe? Um, is my grandmother safe? It was a
Yeah.
lot. I felt a lot of responsibility, even though it wasn't all mine.
Yep.
As a parent, a daughter, a business owner. So um, there was almost no time to feel or think. Like, I think it was a lot of, and this is just maybe a little bit more my personality. It was like, push it all down and go, because it was so unknown. And we reached sort of a point maybe 2 years in where I had to, I was like running on empty, and I had to take a step back and just take a minute to really understand what had happened, because there was no time to think. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously we thought in the moment, but there was no time to plan. Projections all went out the window. And
Yeah.
like March 15th, 2020, all projections went out the window.
I remember, so at the time, I've since sold it, but I had an e-commerce uh brand, and it was just e-commerce. And we were thinking the other way. We were like, maybe we should start getting into stores and testing that out. And the the trade show we were going to be at, which was the Green Living Show, because it was an
Mm-hmm.
eco-friendly brand. And that day that we were about to set everything up at the Green Living Show, everything shut down. So same thing, they gave us our money back.
I
And
remember this.
oh, you
Yeah,
do?
I remember this because I think you guys were set up. What we were moving into our show the day you were tearing down that show, so we had to.
Wow.
So I was aware of that show, and that's pretty crazy, because at least we had one week's notice, 2 weeks notice of cancellation. But to be
Yeah.
like, was your car packed? Was your
Our
booth
car was
packed and
packed.
ready?
We had product ready that was like specific for the show, and we had done like huge inventory orders just for that show. And you buy your whole booth and what that's going to look like. Like, never mind the cost of renting at the Green Living Show, but like you pay for your pull-up banners and your, the whole aesthetic of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a very sad moment, but we ended up being like, okay, let's just double down on e-commerce. And we saw huge growth online as well. Like it's just a weird
See?
time.
But would you agree? Would you agree that I mean, that was an intense pivot for
Yeah.
everybody, because we didn't know what was happening. There were so many unknowns. But I think for entrepreneurs, and I'm curious if you agree, if you were able to pivot in COVID, which everyone pivoted a million times, and make it through, that is the most intense version of entrepreneurship. Like
Yeah.
it really is. Entrepreneurship is sort of like a less intense version of that, where you're constantly pivoting. You have to take whatever is happening in the economy, in your life, with your business, with manufacturing. Like there's so many small things that you have to be adaptable to be able to.
I totally agree. And I think COVID in itself was like this black swan event, but then every trickle down effect were like additional black swans if I just don't know what's going to happen. Like is China going to exist and still manufacture? Can we get boats to Canada? Like are people going to even like trust opening packages in their house? Like how are they going to Lysol down a t-shirt?
Mhm.
Like there was just so many questions
Unknowns.
and so many unknowns. But yes, I agree that for us, it made me really consider if this is just like a taste of what the next like 10 years as an entrepreneur will look like, is that what I want? Like it helps you kind of identify if being a founder and being an entrepreneur is a future, because you just had a condensed version of it in a short amount of time. So
Sure.
the perseverance that you had is impressive. I'm curious how you helped grow, a strong culture, a strong business with all the things we just talked about, the scariness, the hecticness, the
Mhm.
unknowns.
Going into COVID, in the 2 years leading up to COVID, I was having a lot of conversations with my director of operations about, what's important to you might be different than what's important to me. So how do we have a company where we're, aware of everyone's needs without, it's really impossible to be aware of every single person's needs and meet every single person's needs. But how can we
Right.
have the flexibility to be able to say, what is important to you? Because for some people, what is important is a great health plan. For other people, what's
Right.
important is flexible hours. And so what makes one person happy in a work environment doesn't necessarily make someone else. And so when we talked about office culture for us, it was, well, I don't think we're the type of company where Friday drink cart is going to do it for people. And I think it was especially because my director of operations and I, at the same time, we were both, pregnant with our third kids. So we were at a very different time in our lives.
Yeah.
And what COVID ended up doing was kind of solving that for us, because a lot of people, or a lot of people that are now on our team, were very specialized people who worked for big corporations who had had enough. And COVID
Yeah.
was like their final straw, and they're like, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. It's like the intensity of their job mixed with the extra intensity of the pivot was just like, I'm done. So we were able to bring on these very high level people who we wouldn't necessarily have been able to afford as a full-time employee as part of our team, but to bring them on for, 40 hours a month, 50 hours a month. So basically they're giving us a few days a week to work on very specific things. And these people have now been part of the company for 4 or 5 years. And they're part of everyday decisions, but they have 3 or 4 clients that they're doing this for, as opposed to just working for one company.
I was just listening to a podcast and they were talking about um that CEOs should be working 24/7 and that they shouldn't take breaks, because then that indicates to the employees that like that the CEO is not completely dedicated because they have things outside of the
What
company.
podcast was this?
The All In podcast, I like had a visceral reaction to it because part of what they were saying, I think the additional context is it was like um I forget the company, but it was a CEO of like a publicly traded company, and the CEO was saying, I shut off at 5 p.m. and I turn off, and if you want to contact me, it has to be throughout the workday. And they were saying, as a publicly traded company, you can't communicate that message.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a visceral reaction because maybe not. That's true for a publicly traded huge corporation. I think it was Starbucks, actually, the CEO of
Mm-hmm.
Starbucks, but whatever. But then by them saying that, that trickles down to other CEOs who then might feel that way and say, well, I am 100% dedicated to my company, but I also am dedicated to my family and my kids and whatever else is in their life. How do you react to that, or how do you feel about balancing your company and work?
I think it's an answer from someone who is able to turn off all their other responsibilities. You know, I have the same way I have a team at work, I have a team at home. I have an incredible nanny, incredible, who I wouldn't have survived the last 5 years
Right.
without, because I'm a very hands-on mom. I want to put my kids to sleep. I want to, I had to basically sit down and say, what are the things that I want to do and can do? And what are the things that are taking up too much of my time? So the best advice I was actually given from another female CEO was, you need to staff up at home the same way you staff up at your office to be able to have successful work-life balance. And that was something that no one had said to me when my kids were born, because I didn't have any other examples of female entrepreneurs who didn't take mat leaves. Everyone else I knew had a mat leave where they were paid by their company, all
Yeah.
deferring in time, but it was still a separation from work. You know, I gave birth and my phone was pinging like crazy through the entire thing. I didn't check it but it wasn't possible for me to turn off 100%. The flip side is, as a female CEO, like, I can go home for dinner and I can be there to put my kids to bed, because I have the ability to also work once they're in bed for a few more hours to get caught up and ahead on the next day. So to say,
Mm-hmm.
a CEO should always be there, and that's not, that might be realistic for a man. I don't think that's realistic for a woman with children. But I also don't know what it's like to have 100 employees. So I think that would be the biggest
No, I
difference.
appreciate that answer. It's been like, I listened to the podcast yesterday or 2 days ago, and it's just been, and you're just like, I hear what you're saying, and but like it's just not sitting well. So
It's not
I
black and white. I think that's the
yeah.
main thing. It's not black and white. And I think that there maybe aren't enough examples of female CEOs coming into the conversation. Like, I'm very vocal about it because, like I said, everyone was like, oh, you'll have babies, you'll work when they sleep. Sure, that's for someone when they're saying you'll work when they sleep. That's for someone who needs to, like, you know, pay a parking ticket, not someone who needs to run a company, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So I'm very passionate about saying, there's no shame in asking for help. You
Yeah.
absolutely should. And I think that help at home and or help at work, it's like, structure your home life the same way you would structure your office to make sure, everything's getting done efficiently.
I love the staffing at home idea. It's genius. And I had another episode a while ago, and a CEO who's a mom, um I believe it was the CEO of the company Shift Collab, and she was talking about, it's a similar idea, but that it takes a village, and she has chosen who that village is, and she's hired
Mm-hmm.
that village to support her, and she prioritized very similar. Like, she wants to be there for bedtime, she wants to be there for dinner, uh, um, and that gives you room to then prioritize the other pieces at work, and then also empowering people at work to take ownership when you're not there.
For sure. I think what people don't talk about enough is, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, even like the 80s, it was a lot of women stayed home and raised their kids. So those same women, us, who are now us, are like, the advice my mother gave me was, actually, when I was in university, my parents said, they gave some suggestions of maybe what I wanted to do. And I said, like, none of those are me. Like, it was just, I couldn't understand why they were saying, why don't you go in this direction, that direction? It's only now that I understand it was because these were jobs that you could turn off at 5 o'clock. And so I think
Right.
it was them reflecting, or my mom reflecting maybe on what it was like to have 3 kids, and knowing how difficult, like, how to do that. Because I
Yeah.
in junior high school, I got home economics. Like, they taught us how to sew, which is great because I started making headbands. But like, they taught us how to sew and how to cook. Like, what about, I don't know, how to do your taxes?
I agree. And I think, to your point of like having maybe the model female CEO who has children and look up to them, and how do they balance, it's also the model for men of how to also help create a balanced home life,
Mm-hmm.
because maybe you hire to do all that help, but also maybe there's like a balance in the partnership where it doesn't just fall on one partner to do all of those things, and you can um find more ways to split up some of those chores and tasks, but transition for our generation, I think.
It is. And it's a topic that I talk about a lot because I have two girls and a boy. And so it's like, how do we raise our girls to be strong, independent women? But I want to also know, how do I raise my son to be an empathetic and giving partner,
Yeah.
but I want it to be inherent. I don't want
Yeah.
it to be, how can I help you? I want it to be like, of course, like household duties are shared, and you have to model that behavior.
I love it. Well, perfect wrap up for my final two questions.
Okay.
Um, you've been a founder for a very long time now, and I'm sure, and you've mentioned that you've kind of given advice and helped mentor other entrepreneurs along the way. I'm curious if there's a myth that either you were told or that you've heard from other founders, but a myth that you would want to dispel for future entrepreneurs.
I think it would be the idea that you need to have everything like perfectly planned out and ready before you launch. Um, there's so much learning and growth in those mistakes, as we've discussed. And so I think, having an idea and a concept, working through it and getting to a place where maybe a soft launch is feasible, like just go for it, because you will learn more in those first few months of launching than you ever would by honing and trying to make it perfect.
Amazing. And my last question, as you know, the podcast is called How I Became, and we've talked a lot about your journey, your background, your family. If you were to think about where you are now, how I became, how would you fill in the rest of that sentence? So how Jaimie became dot dot dot.
Um, I would say how Jaimie became a 20-year overnight success. I think that people take notice once you've reached a certain level of success, but they don't necessarily realize the years of hard work that led up to it. For me, it's been 20 years of continuous growth and evolution to get where.
Amazing. Jaimie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was such an incredible conversation. I like the amount of topics that we've hit is amazing, but I really, really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to share this episode out.
Thank you. It was a great